Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. I am Cyril Obi, the Program Director of the Social Science Research Council's African Peace Building Network and Next Generation Social Sciences in Africa program. And I warmly welcome you to the presentation of a new book titled Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration of Ex-Combatants in Africa, edited by a former APN Fellow, 2016 to be precise, Dr. Ibrahim Bangura, a lecturer in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, Furabe College, University of Sierra Leone. This book examines the practice of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration in Africa, using empirical evidence to explore the theories, contextual realities, and approaches that have informed its evolution, the challenges it has encountered, and its positive and negative implications for peace and stability on the continent. The book has 17 chapters authored by scholars, practitioners, and civil society activists, and is expansive both in its scope, rigorous in terms of its research, and also quite in-depth and current in terms of the ground it attempts to cover. A little bit about the APN. The APN is a program that is committed to the production of high-quality field-based research on conflict-affected countries and regions in Africa. And we do hope to connect the research outputs or research findings of our fellows to actual policies and practices. In terms of networking, we connect researchers to researchers, we connect researchers to practitioners, and we hope that the research findings will shape actual policies and practices on the ground in the area of peace building. And you can say that we are committed to building a community of knowledge and practice on the continent. Today, we have the editor to present the book to this distinguished audience. We have two discussants who will bring in some very interesting critique as well as insights into unpacking this amazing book. And we have four of the contributors who will be speaking to their chapters and highlighting the important points that they make. Our contributors are Dr. Irma Specht, Dr. Jibril Sessi, Dr. Luisa Maria Dietrich Ortega, and Dr. Simbarashi Bukurume. And we have as our distinguished discussants, Dr. Nelson Opong and Professor Aziz Olaninu. They will be introducing themselves fully, but in the interest of time, I will invite our editor, Ibrahim Bangura, to give us an overview of the highlights of this very important book. Ibrahim, you have 12 minutes, and welcome again. Ibrahim is muted. Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Obi, for your kind words, and a million thanks to the African Peace Building Network of the Social Science Research Council for backing this entire project and supporting this launch. Let me also thank our colleagues and friends from across the world who have taken their time to join us today, and all the contributors to this volume, whose ideas, energy, and effort got us this excellent piece of academic work. I am happy that we have together contributed to knowledge production and distribution in the field of DDR in Africa. I am also particularly grateful for the support received from the Routledge Studies in Peace, Conflict, and Security in Africa series, the team consisting of Helena Hord, Katrina Lede, and Rosie Anderson. This is our second time of working together on an edited volume, and you continue to provide the space and voice for the articulation of distinct African perspectives to global conflict, development, and security issues. The idea of producing an edited volume on DDR was stimulated in 2006, actually in a small but amazingly beautiful town called Landgraaf in Limburg in the Netherlands. We were preparing training materials for an integration course that we were organizing in Birmingham in the UK that year. And myself and Irma Specht, who is here with us today, spoke briefly on the need to produce a book that will bring together our collective experiences from the field. We left it at that then, but the idea never died. And such ideas will never die when you have mentors like Professor Obi, Professor Kenneth Omoje, Professor Abubakar Ba, and Emeritus Professor Anis Wilkes, my doctoral professor, whose inspiration has been remarkable. More than 17 years after, working on DDR in diverse contexts has provided me with deeper insights and knowledge of the concept. I have witnessed the deep, horrific legacies of war and its toll on humankind. Throughout these years, I have been inspired and at the same time shocked by the resilience of those who survived conflict both as perpetrators and victims. In my journey in the DDR world, I have met and engaged both active and former combatants in countries including my own, Sierra Leone, Liberia, South Sudan, Colombia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, among several other countries that I've worked in. Those combatants have year in, year out shared with me their stories, their fears, their regrets, and their hopes and aspirations. I must admit that while it has been a privilege meeting many combatants in the field and learning about their experiences, their resilience in transitioning from violence to peaceful citizens have been a huge source of inspiration for me. As I indicated in the book we are here to launch today, on many occasions, I have found it difficult to distinguish between who is a victim of war and who is not. I say this not to minimize the suffering of victims, but having understood the complexity and ever-evolving nature of conflicts, I know it is a catastrophic event for all participants. These experiences and sometimes the dark nightmares they relive in my mind have pushed me and others to not just contribute to academic discourse on the trajectory of conflicts and DDR and its related tools, but we feel obliged to tell the experiences of those whose participation in wars leave behind a trail of physical, economic, social, and psychological damage that too often are missed by the quick fixes of DDR programs aimed at contributing to ending the throes of war. As a friend of mine, Dr. Henry Bawa, one of the contributors to this volume, remarked in his chapter on Sierra Leone, people enter wars as innocent players, but no war leaves anyone innocent wherever they stand, be them combatants or civilians, as they all lose their innocence and peaceful lives. For the benefit of colleagues who may not be very familiar with the field of DDR, I will attempt to historicize a bit. With the end of the Second World War in 1945, the United Nations was established to, among others, save humanity from the scourges of another world war, promote international peace and security, and protect fundamental rights and freedoms. However, the birth of the UN also coincided with the inception of the Cold War, a period in which the world experienced several inter- and intrastate conflicts resulting from the ideological struggle between the two major powers, the United States of America and Russia. Thus, the UN was constrained to effectively enhance international peace and security. It was in 1989, with the end of the Cold War in sight, that the UN became actively involved in DDR, when it deployed the UN Observer Mission in Central America, UNUCA. Since then, it has deployed several peacekeeping missions with parts of their mandate being to support DDR processes. Additionally, UN agencies such as the United Nations Development Programme and the United Nations Children Fund also support components of DDR programming. In Africa, we've had several programs implemented in countries like Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Sudan, Mozambique, and Angola. Each chapter of the book we're here to launch reflects on the fact that each conflict and DDR processes are unique, presenting their own dynamics, opportunities, and challenges, which can be negotiated through a combination of careful contextual analysis and studying past experiences. In support of this, the comparative studies of experiences across a range of African settings in this volume are intended to provide a resource for academic advocates, policymakers, and practitioners working in the fields of DDR and peace building, including those grappling with the specific dynamics of context involving armed groups designated as terrorist organizations. Together, they offer a broad appraisal of contemporary DDR practice, backed with a wide range of contextual evidence, as well as reflections on thematic areas such as transitional justice, gender, countering violent extremism, and support for children associated with armed forces and groups as they relate to DDR programs. The book is divided into 4 components, with the first and fourth sections introducing, conceptualizing DDR in a complex world, and providing key conclusions. The second section examines cross-cutting issues, including children, gender, and transitional justice. The third section interrogated specific case studies, including Somalia, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and South Sudan. It also examined cases of countries that experimented with DDR over 20 or 30 years ago, with most of them using the first generation of traditional DDR model. That largely means that DDR processes were conducted as a product of peace agreements signed by governments and belligerent factions. The essence of bringing to the fore what we dub lessons from the past was to examine the socioeconomic and political status of ex-combatants, get their perspectives on their reintegration process, and understand the successes and challenges with which they are faced. A critical observation from the countries studied is that there's an inability of states, such as Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Angola, to address the root causes of their conflicts, resolving challenges that led to conflict in the first place, and thereby resulting in them remaining trapped in the post-conflict trajectory several years after the end of their conflicts. As indicated in the introduction of the book, while the nature of conflict is evolving, the root causes of men and women, and sometimes children, picking up arms remain the same. These include widespread poverty, lack of access to economic opportunities, socio-political marginalization, the inability to exercise agency, and the lack of respect in extremely hierarchical, patriarchal, and gerontocratic societies. These continental deep-rooted issues have further exacerbated environmental degradation and the brutal state repression of democratic movements that have sprung up on the continent in the wake of the Arab Spring in 2011. The heavy-handedness of the state and its repression of the opposition, the media, civil society have significantly undermined trust between states and their citizens. This has contributed to community support for armed groups, which has enormously contributed to the spread of violent extremism and jihadism in Africa. The burden and consequences of these problems fall on young people. This points to the need for utilizing approaches including DDR and its related tools that are youth-focused and gender-responsive. While a majority of DDR programming and tools have traditionally been very technically oriented, DDR has since had an expanded mandate and is currently inclusive of various professions. Our book argues that the subjectivity of conflict and its changing context have led to the recognition that DDR programming and peace building at large needs to be tailored to be gender sensitive and responsive, localized, and context specific. Years of experience in the field of DDR have brought to light the fact that a universal approach to DDR may undermine its core objective, potentially leading a society back into violence or limiting opportunities to promote sustainable peace. This conclusion begs the question of whether DDR processes need far more broader understanding outside of a project management lens to more integrated approach to post-conflict peace building, taking into consideration the limits of DDR. The aftermath of the attack on the United States of America on 11 September 2001, followed by the Arab Spring, which started on 18 December 2010, has significantly contributed to the rise of violent extremism in Africa. Consequently, several countries on the continent are currently experiencing conflicts that involve violent extremist groups. As indicated in the chapter on DDR and CV, this experience has placed countries in a difficult situation, especially given the limited expertise on the continent to deal with violent extremism. Alongside this, the legal and human rights complexities involved in dealing with such groups leave traditional approaches to DDR less able to support the transition of fighters into civilians. As such, there has been the need for adaptation and more direct involvement of the military in those processes, especially given the fact that they are conducted amid ongoing conflicts. It was concluded from the chapters on Nigeria and Somalia that there is the need to demilitarize the de-radicalization and reintegration components of programs within DDR and CV nexus. The use of civilian experts and the ability of governments to use a human security-based approach to programming will go a long way in strengthening adapted programs. In countries such as Somalia and Nigeria, the heavy-handedness of security sector actors has been noted to be part of the reasons why people join armed groups. This has also been observed in countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, and Libya, where instead of mobilizing communities to prevent and counter violent extremism, some of the communities are themselves perceived by state actors to be working in collaboration with armed groups, thereby leading to a sustained violation of their rights, which pushes them further into their support for armed groups. The shift from interstate to intrastate conflict in Africa has placed local communities at the center of DDR activities. Thus, the success or failure of DDR depends greatly on the willingness and ability on the part of communities to support the program, particularly the reintegration component. Consequently, as argued in the conclusion of the book, a community-based approach is much more realistic and sustainable to supporting ex-combatants on a longer-term basis, providing communities with absorption capacity, the ability to undertake healing and reconciliation activities, and providing ex-combatants with longer-term psychosocial support. It was further concluded in this volume that one of the identified gaps in DDR programming is the limited focus on mental health and psychosocial support. MHPSS is integral to the success of DDR, as well as sustainable peace building that is required for the overall stabilization and post-conflict reconstruction of communities and societies at large. The cycle of violence is maintained by unresolved inner and invisible wounds long after the external wounds of society have appeared to heal. The longer-term healing, social cohesion, and restorative process can only be dealt with using the various tools offered by integrating MHPSS into DDR programming. This is even more critical now as community reintegration programs deal with a wide range of actors, including ex-combatants, internally displaced persons, remainees, and returnees. The devastating consequence of conflicts on the continent take a heavy toll on their victims, with societies unable to provide services to address the immediate and longer-term needs of both ex-combatants and community members. Thus, as a follow-up to this book, I have started working with my sister and long-term associate, Madame Kirindi Odindo, on a paper on DDR and MHPSS to interrogate key questions on the effective mainstreaming of MHPSS in DDR programming. Another point made in the book is that policymakers, researchers, and training institutions have not succeeded over the years in having an integrated and collaborative approach to DDR. Thus, the three groups have largely been operating in isolation, failing to maximize their contributions through harmonizing efforts and contributing collectively to enhancing the design and implementation of DDR in both Africa and other parts of the world. We hope that the research working group of the Integrated DDR Training Group, the IDDRTG, of which I am a member, will eventually be able to encourage the filling of this gap. We need to see effective collaboration and coordination of efforts to enhance policies and practices on DDR and peace building in Africa. In concluding, let me state that through this journey,
I hope this is the last sentence.
Yes, I had
Thank
four
you.
very supportive colleagues.
Thank you.
Rhoda, Mwendo Kilo, Shreya, Pordel, Ksenia Litivnova, and Nicola Morgan. They worked fantastically with me. And I also want to say a big thank you to institutions like the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, the Barcelona International Peace Center in Spain, and most importantly, Transition International, of which I'm a partner, for the support throughout the work that we've done on this project. So let me end here and say a big thank you to all of you. There will be a second volume 2 years from now that will build on the work that we've done. And I'll pass over to Professor Cyrilo.
Thank you very much. We forgive you for stepping a bit over time, but I will quickly move on to our next speaker, who is a contributor, Dr. Irma Specht of Transitional International Landgraf in the Netherlands. Irma, you have the floor, and you can speak for 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. Let me first say thank you for the honor to contribute to the book and to present today. But let me quickly take you to the cattle camps of the Nuer ethnic group in South Sudan. That's where one of my chapters is about. I have the honor to have 2 chapters, but I chose this one because when I started to study anthropology, the introduction section of the opening day, the professor said, "Welcome to the education for unemployment. If you want a job, please leave the room." I'm very glad I stayed because that was true at the time, but thanks God that the world has realized we need more anthropologists and more anthropological insights to actually provide deeper context analysis in the about the regions where we are working. I've myself worked for the past 25 years on DDR and related conflict issues and settings. So the Nuer in South Sudan is an ethnic group where I did research from 2015 to 2018 among a group called the White Army, which has estimate numbers of about 500,000, where I did 250 interviews and several periods of participatory observation. So the White Army is in fact a very old cultural institution. It's called an armed group by many, but I'm arguing in my chapter that that might not be the best name for them, and therefore the approach to them might also be different. So the White Army is a very old cultural institution, even before it was called White Army, where initiated adolescents move to cattle camps and live there. So it's like a rite de passage where they around 14, 15, 16 get initiated, and then they move to the cattle camps to take care of the cattle. They choose their own leaders based on being brave, and the girls sing and have very good and horrible songs about brave and not so brave men. So that's where a man becomes a man and a woman becomes a woman, and they're there together, the girls and the boys. The boys mainly have the role to protect and to attack, and the girls milk the cows and they cook. But also the girls get trained in using the guns in case the camps get attacked. The roles of the White Army is in the first place to protect and to take care of the cattle, but also to obtain more wealth, which is traditionally done through cattle raiding, which, by the way, also has a good function of mixing different types of cattle, so you're mixing breeds. And a very important role they play, as it's the youth of the community, is to protect their communities against threats from outside. So that's where we're going. But first, an important point is maybe the religious dimension. So the Nuer have a very strong belief in ancestral and also air spirits. And these spirits are embodied in prophets. So even when you read very old literature about the Nuer, there were always the prophets who guide and protect the fighters. So the oldest prophecy is of Ngandum, and he predicts, and this is very important, the eventual winning of the Nuer. So this is a very old prophecy, and the spirit of the prophet goes into next generation. So we have a Nyungdeng prophet at the moment. And the story is that, yes, a lot of Nuer will die, but eventually we will win. Yeah. So this gives a lot of motivation, but as you can imagine, it also blocks the peace process, because in the back of the mind of many people, any compromise is just a compromise, a step in time, because eventually they will win. As all cultural institutions, they adapt to changing environments, and so is the White Army. So the White Army is very reactive. It's very different from one location to the other, and over time. So when I started to research, there was already documented evidence of the White Army. And in fact, this chapter is again just a point in time, because it keeps evolving and it keeps changing. It takes different forms over time and in different locations. And during the time of the research, the White Army fought on the battlefield, or the same battlefields as the SPLA in opposition. And then people quickly drew the conclusion in several publications and policy documents, and even in the Secretary General report of 2014, talking about the White Army being an armed group, almost paramilitary to the SPLA in opposition. Now, this research shows that that's not the case, and it's not that simple. In fact, they are operating in the same place, in the same area. They have the same ethnic group. But for them, they're not part of this bigger conflict, and they're not part of the bigger political agenda. They often don't even know about it and don't understand it. But whenever SPLA in opposition there would be a battlefield, they would move in, and they basically meet at the battlefield level. So they don't get any payment, they don't get any weapons. For them, it's an opportunity to revenge, because as you remember, in that period, there was very extreme, heavy violence, also from SPLA into the areas and attacking villages quite systematically. So there was an opportunity to take revenge, but also very much an opportunity to loot. So what you would have is SPLA being in the front, and then the White Army being there and coming after and taking uniforms and guns and other equipment from dead soldiers, etc. So I only have 8 minutes. It's very complicated. So, but let me get to my conclusion then. So if you hear this, and if you believe what I found has some truth, then you can imagine that DDR is not very appropriate as a tool. First of all, you cannot demobilize a cultural institution. It might change, and you might even affect it, fostering some change, as a DDR program, or even external actors or a government that is there as part of this environment where this cultural institution is adapting to. Further, so that's the D, the D from demobilization. Disarmament, you cannot really disarm them because the threat is too high. There are other tribes and all kind of political actors that have guns. They also need the guns to protect the animals, even from groups coming across borders. So unless the government can secure the area and make sure that the people, but also their wealth, in this case animals, are protected, they will need their arms. So you cannot demobilize them, a cultural institution. You cannot disarm them because they need their arms. And there's no need to reintegrate them because they are fully reintegrated. They're little heroes. The communities are cooking for them and bringing it to them. They play their role, their traditional role of defending their communities. So what then? There is a problem. There is huge groups of young people and also under 18 which makes it even against international law, fighting, using weapons, killing, and everything. So what could be discussed in a longer engagement process with them is maybe to see if these people can join at a little bit later age. It's very difficult because you normally get initiated around 14, 15, so moving it to 18, but it's not impossible if they see the point. One of the reasons why also all these young boys go there is it's the only way to get enough cattle to marry. So, and the bride price is very high. I know that in other countries, successfully, the bride prices, the cultural institutions have been changed to lower the bride price, maybe from 100 heads to 2 heads. That would definitely reduce the need to join these cattle camps and diversify opportunities for young people for work, that it's not only cattle. And of course, provide security. So I don't think DDR is the right tool for this group of people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irma. You have raised a lot of interesting points, but that will come up during the Q&A session. Thank you once more. I will now invite Dr. Jibril Sese to please speak to the highlights of his own book chapter. You are muted, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to my chapter in the book. There are a number of basic points I would like to point out at the onset. One is about what we'll say contestation of appellations. Is DDR the right word to use to describe what had been happening in Somalia, and other places, and based on this, we may also need to look at the fact that in Somalia there were the absence of conditions assumed for the various generations of DDR, first generation, second generation, third generation, and we're also making the argument that we may be having a transition to a fourth type here that we need to look at, because if you look at the various generations of DDR, there are various emphases. We're beginning to see here that in Somalia, in relation to the peace and other processes, there is a move towards emphasizing the fight against terrorism and violent extremism, and the question of the transnational nature of the challenges that they are having in the country. I mean, having set those parameters, we would. It has been argued that for more than 2 decades, given the complexities and of the conflict in Somalia, it is imperative to rethink and contextualize the use of DDR, of ex-combatants as an approach to stabilization and peacekeeping in the country, and peace building in the country, and that DDR, the whole process of DDR itself in Somalia is sort of unique. There are certain assumptions about the very first generation of DDR that was not the case in Somalia. First, the first generation of DDR built the assumption that there is a state around which we need to anchor the DDR and existing state, and that belligerent factions come to a negotiated settlement, and then DDR is one of the components of in the agreements that had been signed. That was not the case in Somalia when the first generation of DDR were being implemented, because at that particular time, the state had collapsed in Somalia in the 1990s, and the country was embroiled in very, very intense violence, with several attempts at building the state failing. However, by 2005, a cobbled together state authority was itself very, very weak, and was in fact outside Somalia itself. So these are some of the challenges there in relation to that. But something again that we need to look at is that in certain Somalia, there was a mishmash of the various aspects theorized in the second and third generation DDR that we see them being implemented in some, mishmash fashion in the country itself. I mean, we see some of the programs aimed at enhancing stability, others on violence reduction, others looking at bringing community players into the whole thing. But then now, I mean, these things relating to the first, second, and third generation. Because we're talking about the first generation, it's about disarmament of ex-combatants. The second generation is about brought into the picture, bringing in the community to play a part in DDR. And then the third generation is about how to look at, in addition to disarming the combatants, bringing in communities, also about emphasizing terrorism and trans-border crime and all that. But then in the various DDR processes, we begin to see that now in Somalia, there is there are attempts to put a greater emphasis on the fight against terrorism, over and above some of the other aspects that were emphasized during the other periods in the other generations of DDR. Something else that we also want to look at is that the nature of Somalia, the society in Somalia, clan-based, and these clans that traditionally had security and governance and functions. And how do we, get them to be part of a DDR process that would bring about their disarmament, their demobilization, and the other R's within the DDR trajectory itself? Because how, as the previous speaker was saying, how do you disarm, a culture that had clans that were organically, within the culture itself, had security functions, and how do you look to demobilize them when they are part and parcel of the culture itself? And related to reintegration, there are also other issues relating to that. But again, if you look at the trajectory of Somalia's recent history, we begin to see how some of these functions and the collapse of the Somalias of the Somali state under Siad Barre, and how people also would bring on the platform of clans some other extra clan security concerns, and will bring about a lot of disruptions within society. And then we see neighboring countries also being part of the whole issues relating to what was happening in Somalia when Siad Barre, decided to invade Ethiopia, and then the consequences of that will bring about Ethiopia also, counterattacking, and also utilizing the services of some of the other clans within Somalia that had issues with how the Siad Barre dictatorship was moving, and how that itself, contributed to the collapse of the Somali state. And then we had the rise of the Islamic court system that was also about returning security to the country, but then it used something that's also very traditional to Ethiopia, to Somalia society, the fact of Islam, and then how they use that to as both an ideological weapon and also a form of legitimacy to talk, okay, all right, this is how we do it, right? And how that by itself, again, had a lot of support. But then the fact that their own version of Islam, was against some other players internationally, and how that again would lead to the collapse of that particular system. And in fact, one of the players within the Islamic court system, that will emerge as the Al-Shabaab movement that would fight against some of these perceived situations relating to how they were taken by neighbors and others. So all these complexes are there within the Somali system itself, and the use of Islam, the fact that, and then the rise of the global fight against terrorism, and how that is now shifting the focus relating to how to look at DDR itself, and the move towards de-radicalization as an important component within DDR processes. So this emphasis, are we seeing a shift here from the traditional generations or the 3 generations that we've seen within DDR process towards a fourth one that wherein the emphasis moved towards those of international players, and there are a lot of foreign players within Somalia itself with great interest in what is happening in the state, in the conflict in the Arabian Peninsula, having its own effect there, with various countries out there also trying to see how they could use Somalia as a platform for moving forward with their own agendas that are not actual, that may not be even agendas that are indigenous to Somalia itself. But again, the fact is that a lot of the issues that come up in relation to DDR, in relation to the state in Somalia, in relation to how which aspects of DDR are emphasized, also indigenous to what is happening within Somalia, the age-long conflict between clans for supremacy, and some other cultural things relating to the fact of youth being there to enforce the role of elders and the position of women and all that. But then we see various players now within the whole trajectory of security complex in terms of peace, in terms of the DDR and the various components that emphasize. And of course, again, another major player, there's the federal government of Somalia itself, and how that was cobbled together, and how it also has its own challenges as far as its relationship with AMISOM, the UN, or now that we ATISOM now ATMIS in Somalia, now the new transition to the African Union transition mission in Somalia, and now the conflicts there, and what to emphasize. The government want to make sure that it defeats Al-Shabaab militarily in the field, and other players have other ways of looking at the whole thing. And this whole thing, just all of this bring a lot of complexities into the DDR terrain. And so these multi-actors, communities, the armed groups, foreign governments, and governments within the neighborhood itself, they all have their own security concerns. Kenya has its own security concerns because it has a large Somali population in its northern borders, and there have been histories of counter armed actions and armed actions by those groups. And the issue also with Ethiopia also, it has also security concerns related to how it will pursue its own security concerns in Somalia or on its own border, because there had been issues of war between Somalia and Ethiopia relating to the fact that there's a large Somali population in Ethiopia. And
yeah,
but also,
can you round up, please? We are a bit pressed for time now.
Thank you very much. The argument here is that the situation is so complex that traditional approaches to DDR need to be looked at and to address the uniqueness of the situation within Somalia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jibril Sesse of Furabi College, University of Sierra Leone. You have, in a sense, related to the first presenter, who spoke more to the cultural dimensions of the complexities and why DDR may want to begin to focus on that dimension. And you have looked at both the internal, the regional, and international dimensions. So thank you so much. It's now my pleasure to call on the next chapter contributor, and that would be Dr. Luisa Maria Jetrich Ortega. Please, Luisa, you have the floor.
Hello and good afternoon. So my name is Luisa Dietrich Ortega. I am based in Vienna, Austria. Greetings to you all. I am a political scientist by training and a feminist by choice. My journey into gender responsive DDR started about 20 years ago as a researcher, practitioner, and activist in the context of Colombia. So when Ibrahim Bangura approached me to write a chapter on lessons learned and promising approaches to gender responsive DDR programming in Africa, first I was puzzled. And I said the only thing I could contribute would be, sorry? Okay. The only thing I could contribute would be in terms of engagement with the literature, with secondary literature, but try to approach this from a south to south perspective, and how also so many processes in Latin America have benefited from insights of the different African contexts. I'm thinking here of anti-colonial struggles, but also national liberation struggles, DDR in programs of humanitarian settings. So my starting point to this chapter is that there is a global pattern of marginalization of women combatants. Women from the ancient history have always been present in armed groups, and they have had active involvement. On average, they do reach about 30% of fighting forces in different roles, in different hierarchical layers. But it is quite stunning that over time, the numbers and the roles of women are ignored in DDR programs. They are portrayed as peripheral. Their contributions are not acknowledged. They are presented just as supporters when they did much more as dependents to male combatants. And this is a very constraining framing, I would say. When looking at the literature, 2/3 of the 54 countries in Africa have had disarmament and demobilization programs. When looking at the very early ones, women and girls were not even identified. For example, when going back to the disarmament and demobilization of Angola, of the UNITA, only 60 women were identified, which is 0.2% of the estimated size of UNITA. Similarly, in Rwanda, 334 women combatants were registered, which equals 0.06% of the fighting forces. So my chapter sets out to argue that DDR processes are deeply gendered processes. They establish who is the actor, who is a threat, who is a victim, who is prioritized and who is deprioritized. So DDR programs are not neutral. They contribute actively to the marginalization of women and girls, either by commission or by omission. And what does this mean for us as practitioners or researchers? It means that we need to challenge and question always our own gendered assumptions. We are currently in the 21st century, right? So best practices exist, experiences exist, knowledge exists. There is no excuse for not having a gender responsive DDR program. And you don't need to be a feminist to actually get this right. It's about being a decent practitioner, a good enough practitioner, wanting to understand the population we are serving. It's about understanding the different needs, interests, motivations, histories, and dreams of the people we are serving. So in my chapter, I'm trying to break up kind of binaries of good and bad, women and men, and capture different people and different groups and their diversities. So in my chapter, you will find different group experiences. I spoke about the particularities of anti-colonial struggles, of national liberation struggles, for example, and what this means in terms of agencies. When listening to what women share about their time, they look back and say, we learned to engage in different roles and different practices. Some of them held leadership positions. In other contexts, it really depends on what their life was before. Being part of an armed group, even if it is restrictive, they might have more freedom of movement. There might be also some access to some comparative more power through marriage, even power in controlling other women. So it is really about identifying in a localized context what this power actually then means to be able to engage in a purposeful ways. It's also about identifying the roles and responsibilities, and also not only what women do for armed groups, but also what armed groups do for women. Do they give them a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of contributing? In my chapter, there is also, we're also speaking about trauma and abuse, gender-based violence. How can we engage in a gender-responsive approach by having the adequate attention of enabling women and men who have suffered violence to heal, to support, to contribute based on their roles as active citizens? It's not either or. So the invitation is to look for how armed groups strive for this functionality of armed struggle and how they link in women and men alike in different roles. So much has been achieved over the years. We have moved from the early programs that focused on or had outright exclusion to a late incorporation of women into existing male-biased schemes. We have had different DDR programs focusing on ad hoc measures and others who had completely separate programs for women, lesser resource, less money. In the subsection 4 of my chapter, I engage with some of the lessons learned, and these are meant as entry points with nuances. So here you will find a section around how standards and policies are relevant to generate momentum for gender mainstreaming, how gender expertise and training is relevant to enable this gender responsive engagement. Needs assessment, data collection need to be timely and adequate to capture the number, ranks, and roles. I have included some examples around cantonment sites. It's about infrastructure and the different understanding of safety in those settings and how involving women in planning processes is absolutely necessary and can improve DDR programs. Elements such as cash assistance, economic reintegration, social reintegration have all their gender-specific components and can make the difference between an enabling gender transformative approach or in turn marginalizing and assigning women to their specific marginalized position. I'm closing now by highlighting 4 different gaps, which I consider that needs to be further researched, further studies, possibly, Ibrahim, for your next and second volume. Number 1 would be man's gendered consideration. Number 2 would be around the nuances of capturing and safeguarding empowerment and agency. How can we engage to maintain that agency that possibly was developed during time in armed struggle? Number 3 is around political reintegration. How can we make sure that ex-combatants can become stakeholders in their own disarmament demobilization process? So this links very much into participation. And last but not least, how to engage local organization and women-led groups. The last phrase of my chapter actually then reads, that DDR program implementers and researchers alike have the opportunity not only to challenge the marginalization of women and girl ex-combatants, but also to contribute to greater gender equality. And that is what I think we should all strive forward together. Thank you so much. Back over to you, Cyril.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ortega. That was a succinct summary of, again, a continuing trend, a critique of DDR, looking at the marginalization of women, but also demanding for the integration of it's more than just integrating women. It's actually calling for equality, inclusiveness, as well as social justice. But we shall come back to this during the Q&A session. Thank you so much once more. And now to the last of our chapter contributors, we have Dr. Simbarashi Bukurume, and he's of Clark University in South Africa. Simba, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Prof, and thank you very much, Ibrahim, for inviting us to contribute a chapter. I think we are privileged also to contribute 2 chapters, but today I'm just going to focus on one, which is the work that me and my colleagues were also part of the SSRC and APN fellowship did in Zimbabwe. So our work on DDR in Zimbabwe focused on ex-combatants and explore how they engage and interact with the state, especially post-liberation era. And we particularly focus on the period from the late 1990s when the country started to face a protracted economic struggles. So in the chapter, we show how the precariousness of the war veterans' livelihoods make them easily mobilized by political elites, especially those within the ruling party, ZANU-PF. And in the chapter, we were actually particularly interested in the ways in which ex-combatants or war veterans are remobilized and deployed by the ruling party before, during, and sometimes after elections to engage in acts of intimidation and violence. And I think this was something that was also quite prevalent in the recent election, where the state security and also ex-combatants were deployed at polling stations to intimidate the voters and also to intimidate the community at large. So we argue in the chapter that in their self-making, the ex-combatants in Zimbabwe think of themselves as entitled to the political governance of the country. And this is actually quite prevalent in the sense that many ex-combatants or war veterans who also have a ministry in the government have been continuously asserting that we will not allow anyone without liberation credentials to rule this country. So you can clearly see that there is that sense of entitlement to the political governance of the country, as well as the economic benefits or spoils that come with being politically active within the ruling ZANU-PF. So we argue in the chapter that although the DDR program helped to transit ex-combatants from war to civilian life, or from being combatants to being civilians. Many of the ex-combatants remain rooted in the post-war political logics that is intricately linked to, expectations of benefiting from the state spoils, as well as benefiting from political influence, or asserting political influence within the country's political terrain. So this is particularly evidence also in the role that the ex-combatants played in the no longer recent, but in the 2017 military transition. What many people say is a coup not coup in Zimbabwe, where the ex-combatants played a very central role in the ouster of the former president, Robert Mugabe. So their argument of mobilizing people to protest and support the military was that we need to restore the nationalist and revolutionary legacy, or ethos, which of course was very evident with how former soldiers or ex-combatants, as well as former military personnel, were deployed in government, particularly in leadership positions, which also speaks to the entitlement that I was talking about with regards to political leadership, as well as the economic and material spoils that comes with being active, especially within ZANU-PF. So our chapter showed how and with what effects or implications ex-combatants continue to be mobilized politically to reinsert and assert themselves in the country's tense and contested political landscape. So we concluded in the chapter that the starkness of war veterans to the colonial past and the remobilization of the war veterans by the ruling party, ZANU-PF, help us to understand the ruling party's continued hold to power from 1980 up to the present. It also helps us to understand the reproduction of political violence in the country, as well as the sustained political polarization that characterize the country's political landscape. We also concluded that the DDR process in Zimbabwe was an incomplete process. Why? Because it focused predominantly on demobilization and disarmament, but paid less meaningful and sustainable attention to reintegration of ex-combatants, which made it extremely difficult for them to shift from being combatants to being civilians. So this also relates to the failure of the DDR process to shift the political, the politics and the political subjectivities of the ex-combatants in terms of how they view their role in terms of the country's politics, and also the benefits that comes from being politically active. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simbarashi, for a succinct summary of your chapter. Like the chapter presented before you, you spoke about the importance of context and the fact that DDR is not neutral. And you spoke about what I would call the success of D&D, but not of reintegration. Thank you once more, and it is now my duty to invite the first of our two discussants, and he is Professor Aziz Oladinyo of the Federal University of Ekiti, to speak to the highlights of the book, provide us with a critique, and probably some suggestions for the book that will follow. So Aziz, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor Cyril. I want to appreciate you for the invitation extended to me to be part of this very important book presentation. Yeah, I have just 8 minutes, and that to me is a major constraint to interrogate what some of the jottings that I have done while reading through this book. So I will try to be brief. And I want to start by also commending Dr. Bangura and his team for this very important book. Yeah, the book is erected on the Dr. When I got the book, I tried to look at, or I tried to reflect on the motive behind the publication of this book, because there are so many books on DDR over the years. So what makes this one? What are they bringing to the table? What is unique about it? So while I read through the book, I now got the motive of Dr. Bangura. So this book is related on its research orientation, which he clearly stated in the acknowledgement section. So Bangura is committed to DDR, and this was triggered by his being a witness to horrible legacies of war and its toll on humanity, and also the resilient survivors of war, either as victims or participants. So I found this very, very interesting, because the fact of the matter is that wars affect both victims and perpetrators. So nobody goes to war and comes back the same way. So wars always take a toll. It could be physical, it could be economic, it could be emotional, it could be psychological. So in Bangura's close encounter with combatants, both active and ex, Bangura has had their living experiences, their fears, their regrets, their hopes, and aspirations. So he has just come to the reality that war perpetrators have stories and experiences to share. However, these narratives are not often captured in several DDR processes in the African continent. So according to Bangura, therefore, the voices of perpetrators of violent conflicts are missed by the quick fixes of DDR programs aimed at contributing to ending the throes of war. In this book, therefore, he tried as much as possible to examine DDR from the angles of the past experiences of combatants, both active and non-active. So he believes that it is by doing this that DDR can be result-oriented. So this becomes imperative because each conflict, just like he said, each conflict and the DDR is unique and with its own dynamics, opportunities, and challenges. Therefore, we can only come to a full grasp of DDR by treating, according to him, by treating each conflict on its own merits. And the DDR curve can be negotiated through a combination of careful contextual analysis and studying past experiences. So it is obvious that the contributors to this volume share this view within, and this is why they came up with this collection. Also, the book adopted comparative and case study methods, and it focused on 10 countries: Nigeria, DRC, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, Liberia, South Africa, Burundi, Somalia, and Zimbabwe. And so the aim of the book is to interrogate the practice and progress of DDR as a support recovery peace-building strategy in Africa. So the question is, how did it meet its mandates? To what extent can we say that the book actually met its mandates? And what are the challenges? And what is the future of DDR based on the content of this book? Now, let me start by saying that the chapters are well structured and well written, and the contributors wrote factually, and I quite enjoy reading the lines of each of the contribution. So I want to say to the attention that the book actually recorded or succeeded in meeting the mandate it set out to achieve. Since I have just 8 minutes, it is impossible for me to do a chapter by chapter analysis. So what I try to do now is just give some takeaways. I call it takeaways from the book. Now, the first thing I discovered, I can say I'm taking away from the book is the notion, or is the reality that for DDR to be effective, it must relate to the contents of the conflict is designed to resolve. And it must accommodate the experiences of the major actors, particularly the combatants, right? And one of the messages of the book, therefore, is that ex-combatants have stories to tell. And until they are allowed to tell the stories, and the context of their actions are thoroughly examined and factored into action, DDR will be very difficult to achieve its aim. So the book is also a mixture of contextual analysis and past experiences. And this reflects in the structuring of the book. You also have stories of ex-combatants in various chapters of the book. So huge content of the book is driven by empirical evidence. Well, the book is not about DDR alone, it also focuses on countering violent extremism. But Bangura actually succeeded in drawing distinction between DDR and the CVE. Although they are similar, but there are differences between the two. And also, I'm also taking away from the book the fact that effective communication is crucial to effective DDR. We see this in Uganda, where attempts to reintegrate the Lord's Resistance Army got slowed down because the fighters in the bush were not properly informed of the process. So it actually affected the implementation of DDR. And I also got to know that DDR takes different routes. So there's no unified approach to its practice. Let me just give examples as contained in the book. In Liberia, a new army was established, and ex-fighters with appalling human rights records were strategically prevented from enlisting in the new army. So the new army was also ethnically balanced and not political. But however, in Sierra Leone, ex-combatants were given options to either integrate into the army or retire voluntarily or learn a trade. So some of the ex-militants were reintegrated into the army, some left on their own volition. Also in Cote d'Ivoire, the bulk of ex-combatants were integrated into the armed forces, into the other paramilitary forces like customs, prison services, forest guard, etc. So this shows dynamics, in the treatment of ex-combatants as reflected in the book. I also got to know that not every armed group can be demobilized. And this is a major findings from the book, from the article on DDR, on the White Army, from the article on White Army. So it is difficult to achieve DDR with the White Army because there's intersection of culture and rebel formation. Because White Army are much integrated in their culture, society, age set, and livelihoods. In this setting, therefore, only, according to her, only some socio-political reforms can take the guns from the boys. So White Army operates within a cultural context, and they have been in the system for decades, right? So, and they operate mainly to protect people and heritage. So in that way, they do not see themselves as rebels. Rather, they see themselves as part of the society, a group that is protecting the society and their people. So in that context, so the mobilization is impossible, and I quite agree with the author of that chapter, right? So according to her, White Army will stay in their communities on the same leadership, under the same leadership and cultural institution, right? So in essence, the White Army underlines the place of culture in discourses on DDR, right? Also, a component of DDR is also the issue of child soldiers. And so different factors trigger child soldiers as experienced in Sierra Leone and South Sudan. So in South Sudan, just like we have the White Army as a cultural setting, and they are youngsters, age of 15, 16, young chaps. So they are child soldiers, right? In all ramifications, right? So the author of the White Army actually engaged with the child soldiers, right? But I do not see the same similar story in the case of Sierra Leone. I was expecting to read the voices of the child soldiers in Sierra Leone, but this is not really the case. But nonetheless, the chapter on Sierra Leone is a well-written and well-presented chapter, addition to the book. Now, the issue of gender too, right? We also got to know that women play a prominent role in rebel movements and violent conflicts down the ages. However, you see, they are not really actually, they are not captured, you know, into DDR programs, because we always with this orientation that, you know, violence is more associated with men, with boys. Right? Whereas this chapter let us know that the women are equally important. They are also part and parcel of rebel movement. All right. And they also argue that 30% of fighting forces are actually women, right? Yet women issues were marginalized in the DDR program. So I see this exclusion, you know, as part of the patriarchal nature of the society. And I think this has to change. Although there have been changes, changes, as examples from Sierra Leone, Liberia, DRC, and South Africa shows. Yet, marginalization is still much in place, and it's not yet completely over. But I'm also taking away the value of DDR, you know, as first steps in reinsertion and info reintegration. You see, because we discovered this the chapter on DRC and the Central African Republic also shows clearly that there are some instances where political settlements and agreement with armed groups are difficult. So in that wise, that's what they call the pre-DDR. So to me, I see the pre-DDR as an innovative approach, you know, to setting the step or the stage for the final DDR process. And this is very, very strategic, and it's a lesson that I think DDR practitioners need to have in mind, right? So another important aspect of the collection is that the socioeconomic reintegration of ex-combatants, right? This is very, very important, because without proper economic integration, right, of ex-combatants, you know, the whole idea of DDR will be defeated, right? And the works on DRC address this frontally. In the same way, the works on Nigeria, the Nigerian amnesty program in Niger Delta, the Operation Safe Corridor in Northeast Nigeria also address it, right? And also the Zimbabwe example shows that shows the consequences of poor economic and political integration of ex-combatants. So if ex-combatants are not economically empowered, you know, so the whole essence of this, because they already have training and they can always revert to militancy, right? So, okay. And you know, the ILO also, you know.
Professor, can you round up?
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much. I have so many, so because of my time, let me quickly.
Yes, please.
Okay, let me quickly. So to me, the strength of the book is that the chapters are empirical. Most of the chapters are empirically grounded. So the book is more of a practical approach to DDR, showing the successes and challenges, and they are very well written. However, not all the chapters are based on fieldwork. I would have loved to hear some more voices of ex-combatants. Also, there are a lot of works on international NGO. Little is done about the local civil society in this volume. And I think there should be more engagement with the local civil society. And also the religious institutions, the role of religious institutions on DDR is also missing to a large extent in most of the literature. Because you know, we tend to not to see much involvement of the religious institutions. Yet, they are part and parcel. They are very fun. Africans are religious people, and they have religious organizations. And in the DDR, for DDR to be effective, the religious institutions must be properly engaged and involved, right? And lastly, and I think this further studies, you know, will address this. And also, lastly, and also, I also love to see engaging with the families of ex-combatants. You know, they have families. What's their aspiration? What is their own orientation, their view about life, about ex-combatants? And I think these are some of the studies. I think that further studies should also engage. I have so many. I have quite
Yes,
some
well, we
takeaway, but
understand, but yes.
I will have to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Okay.
so much. I think you have made some very important points, and the authors know that they still have to do another book and indeed more books. And on that note, it is my pleasure to invite our next discussant, Dr. Nelson Opong, who is of the Center of African Studies, University of Edinburgh. Nelson, you have the floor and you have 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Cyril, for the introduction, and also to the organizers for inviting me. I also want to extend a word of congrats to Bangura and the rest of the authors for the book. So, given the time, I'm hopefully going to be very brief. So just a general point, I often require my students to write a book review as part of the formative feedback that I give them. And I usually caution them to avoid writing a review essay on edited books, in part because it tends to be a bit disparate and difficult to get. I think I'm going to make an exception to this book, particularly when you look at the introduction and the conclusion that Professor Bangura wrote. It really ties in the key themes, the relevant debates. And so on that note, I think it's a really good book. And if I were to follow my co-discussant, I think it also successfully conveys the motive that is set out in the introduction. So I wouldn't hash too much about that. I think just by way of confession, I'm also a very cynical person of DDR. And in part, I think the ways in which it intellectually operates is that it rests on certain false binaries or assumptions about certain binaries. And one of the binaries, which I think Professor Bangura and the co-authors who just spoke have highlighted, is this distinction between victims and perpetrators. And it's in part because it's very difficult to disentangle, especially if you look at the chapter on child soldiers. How do you separate a child from a soldier? On one hand, as a child, is a victim, and on the other hand, as a soldier, is a perpetrator. And so that difficulty of disentangling victims and perpetrators is one of the key issues that I've always had with DDR. But also, I think the ways in which DDR frames victims as passive and also frames perpetrators as people who have agency and who are able to use that agency. And so there is always this spin-off that many argue makes DDR more beneficial to perpetrators and it's not victim-centered. There's also that false distinction that DDR makes between violence and non-violence. And one of the contributors, Simba from Zimbabwe, made the point that in the case of Zimbabwe, the DDR process is incomplete. The question is, what does an ideal complete DDR look like? And it's in part based on my own reading of the peace literature, which I think we tend to view the DDR as something that could best happen when there is no war. And yet, violence in itself is inscribed in the ways in which we think about post-conflict. And especially if you look at the chapter or the reflection that was given on gender, we see the same kinds of violence. Some anthropologists call it slow violence. That also makes itself more prominent in the post-conflict space. And of course, the third one, which the authors also highlight very well, is this false binary that is often drawn between the kind of logical technocratic tools that are often embedded in the liberal peace vis-a-vis the localized and less quote and unquote rationalized dimension of peace building. And so if there's anything that or what I took away from the book is that the book really tries to reclaim DDR and gives us something to be a bit more sober about the ways in which we are cynical. And it's in part because the policy world is changing and also coming closer to some of the critical insights that we have often highlighted around DDR. So the chapter on the AU, I really enjoyed it in part because it gives us a sense of the ways in which at the continental level and at the policy level, people are thinking ways by which we can push the boundaries a bit around issues of sovereignty, issues of responsibility, among others. And so I enjoyed that. I also enjoyed the chapter by Mohamed Suma on transitional justice. And I think here it brings really some of the concerns that I've always had about this binary between victims and perpetrators, which often tends to translate into the choice between transitional justice and also DDR that is often made, and that effort to try and stitch together the ways in which we can conceptually unpack and draw linkages between transitional justice, which many think is more victim-centered, and also the others. So in terms of how I've just been told I have 2 minutes, so I'm just going to give a couple of points that I think could help us to better understand and also improve the ways in which we look at the book. The first one I think has already been asked, and it's about a lot of the normative calls that we make as researchers and also as practitioners in the ways in which we evaluate what a successful DDR should look like and what a failed DDR process. I don't think we have enough sharp tools that enables us to draw those distinctions. And so it's going to be very interesting for us to reflect how to really think conceptually and also from a practitioner perspective, what does an ideal DDR look like? I think the book gives us some grounded the need to kind of strike a balance that respects local context, but we also do know that a lot of the localized norms and localized ideas also are not unproblematic. So problems of gender, patriarchy tends to also figure out at the localized level. And so really what, as practitioners and academics, what should an ideal DDR look like? And how do we really deploy those tools to enable us to draw those normative distinctions? I'm also thinking, because the starting point of the book is really to situate DDR as a tool that reflects the changing context of war. And I think it's many ways grounded in the post-Cold War and post-9/11 context. And I would want to see a bit more of the kinds of changes and reflections that are needed. And here I was thinking about the increasing digitalization and artificial intelligence and all these tools that are being applied to warfare now. Now, I think technology will give us something to think about in terms of DDR, in part because we do not ascribe personalities to these technologies. And so how do we think about demobilization in a context where the chief perpetrators of these conflicts are not human beings or are operated remotely by human beings? And so how do we really reflect on this important tool in the light of the changing character of warfare that is going on? And then finally, I just want us to really then push, especially following from my critique about the need not to draw a false distinction between violence and non-violence, and also based on this understanding that the post-conflict world also has logics of violence that are inscribed in it in ways that propels actors who perpetuate violence in conflict. And I just want us to really reflect on, especially when we look at a lot of these post-conflict contexts where democratic politics is holding sway. In what ways do we position DDR in ways that enables it to complement meaningful democratic engagement rather than what we are seeing in countries where the DDR processes are actually contributing to a deceleration in the democratic journeys? And so how do we think about the ways in which we position DDR as a tool that better complements meaningful democratic engagement? And I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully we can have more discussions based on the key questions that will come from the broader audience. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to engaging further with the authors on this.
Well, thank you to our two excellent discussants for bringing up a lot of interesting points. At this point in the process, I have seen that the Q&A has been ongoing and most of the questions have been responded to, but there's still one question, which I call the surviving question. After that is addressed, I will then request that the editor and the contributors respond to the questions that our two reviewers have raised. So I have two questions in the box, one by Irene Tuyo and the other by Joseph Ibrahim Bahmesanko. Irene says, congratulations, Ibrahim and your crew for all the hard work involved in DDR and the issues around it in Africa. My question is, how have you addressed government complacency in DDR, having in mind the Nigeria Boko Haram and government complacency in reintegrating them into the army? Second, again, is to you, Ibrahim. He says, thanks, Dr. Bangura. As one of your students in Peace and Conflict Studies at FBC, I'm happy for such a bold step as it has given me more zeal to pursue deeper on this. However, I have a question to ask. What ethical considerations should be taken into account when designing and implementing disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration initiatives, particularly regarding the protection of human rights, the prevention of recidivism, and promotion of sustainable peace and development? We have a little bit under 30 minutes. We can extend for maybe 5 minutes, but not beyond. So have this in mind when you are responding. Thank you. You have the floor. Ibrahim.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the question by Irene, which is the first one. I have tried to respond to the other questions. The one by Irene.
You want me to repeat it?
No, I should be able to see it here. Let me just check.
Okay.
No, I'm not seeing
it. It's within the answered tab in the Q&A. The third to last comment.
Okay, I'm not seeing it. I don't know what's wrong for questions. Can someone just read it for me so I can respond quickly?
It is now in the chat box.
Okay. Chat. Okay. Involved in DDR and issues, and how are you addressed? Yes, I must say sometimes I'm super shocked by what is happening in Nigeria when it comes to DDR programming. You have what is known as the Borno model, and you have Operation Safe Corridor. There's limited interaction. There's a lot of duplication of efforts, and there is no synergy and harmonization of effort that will help to have a model that will work for Northeast Nigeria. And we also see that there is limited understanding and knowledge capacity in relation to what could be done to address the existing challenges. There are a lot of combatants, ex-combatants now in Borno, but then you'll see that what they are doing there cannot, at the end of the day, lead to a successful DDR program. Because you cannot have a model that is designed within a framework where taking ex-combatants back into where they came from will lead to what we refer to as the revolving door syndrome. The fundamental question we always ask in DDR is, at the end of the day, you reintegrate ex-combatants to where? You have, I think, about 8 or 10 local government areas in Borno. Not even one is under government control in the fullest of terms. They take combatants into IDP camps, former combatants into IDP camps. While you have Operation Safe Corridor, if there was synergy, Operation Safe Corridor will be able to support the Borno model, but they don't see eye to eye. And there's complete disconnect between what the federal government of Borno wants to do as against, I mean, what the state government of Borno wants to do as against what the federal government wants to do in relation to DDR. Almost as if Nigeria had not dealt with the Niger Delta crisis, and the experiences from the Niger Delta crisis have not been useful to what is happening in Northeast Nigeria. So there's complete disconnect, and that shocks us all the time. The second question has to do with ethics. There's the question of how do you deal with children, right through from the release of children, the setting up of interim care centers, the family tracing and reunification, ethics around programming, ensuring that what is done is right, a human rights-based approach, and also a rights-based approach. And what is it that you do in relation to encouraging and working with women in the light of ensuring gender mainstreaming and the protection and promotion of their rights, welfare, and dignity, all of those. So when you design a DDR program from the onset, it has to be guided by the guiding principles that have to do with DDR. But apart from that, how do you ensure that when you conduct analysis, staff are trained to go out in the field and collect data in the proper sense, ensure that those data are gender disaggregated, but taking into consideration that the mainstreaming of rights should be right through every component of the design and implementation, so to ensure that you participation, inclusivity, and other elements are fully mainstreamed and integrated into that which you do. So ethical considerations are paramount, key, fundamental, and have to be used throughout. But then there should be the reminder for all of those involved in terms of how do they conduct themselves and ensure that no one is excluded, all are included, and also look at the parameters within which DDR functions or is being implemented. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I see also that some questions have been added, one by Joseph Ekwale, in which he's asking whether the book can draw any lesson from DDR in Haiti, and how this relates to the ongoing armed gangs. Is this, can this be ascribed to the failure of CVR undertaken there during the time of the UN mission? I think that's a question. Aishetu Sambo talks about the OSPC and DD, while the R is left for the transition camp. Miriam So has asked a question which I think Irma would want to handle. Osman Jalu also has raised a question, which now I would have to look. Osman Jalu, he is one of your students, if you can find that. He says, my concern is that one of the criticisms on the role of religious parties, how they can be involved in the ongoing process, how can we fix it within the DDR process? So I think you should hold on while Irma responds to Miriam So. Irma, you have the floor to speak briefly.
Sorry, this is the one on the religious leaders, because I was just typing to help Ibrahim to give some responses. Is that?
No, this is the one by Miriam So.
I'm not.
It's a bit long.
I'm not seeing it. Is it in answered or in open?
It is in answers now, 11:34 a.m.
It's high up different times. From the top, from the bottom. Oh, Mariam So?
I can't. Yes, Mariam So.
Okay, wait. Extremely some. I agree with you. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, I didn't know I was pointing to answer that, but just a quick one. There's many different donors, types of donors in DDR, and if you have a UN mission, there is assessed budget. So that's the core funding of the UN. Yeah, which donors are funding DDR? In some countries, the World Bank. There's also donors that fund part of the DDR process, and especially on the reintegration part. The more you go to community-based reintegration, the more you can get broader funding, because that's not just for ex-combatants. It includes, you know, community recovery programming, supporting returnees and stuff. And there, a lot of other bilateral donors are there. In some countries, there's trust funds. On DDR, I think, Ibrahim, you had that in Sierra Leone, no? You had a trust fund where bilateral donors put pooled resources. So there's quite a lot of different options there. Thanks.
Thank you. I see you have already responded to the question about religion. Do you want to add anything to your response?
Yeah, maybe just to respond to that one. I think when we say religious leaders, I think we also have to be careful who are we talking about, because for me, for example, African traditional leaders are sometimes more or equally important than religious leaders in terms of maybe imams or priests or pastors or stuff. But basically, if within a community there's a certain belief, of course the religious leaders can help, because in fact almost all religions have this element of forgiveness, tolerance, acceptance, and also ways and means to kind of cleanse evil, if it's exorcism in Christianity, or washing with some water or other herbs in more traditional settings. So, and also helping the believers to come at peace with what they might have done in terms of perpetrators of violence. I think the role of religion and religious leaders is extremely important to understand, and also to involve them in these processes. Yes.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to invite the contributors to speak briefly, 2 minutes each, on the points and observations that were raised by our two reviewers. So any of the contributors, please. And it's 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. I think maybe I would come in very quickly. Yeah, I think I would like to reiterate on the point that was highlighted earlier, that I think it's important to have a holistic approach to DDR, in the sense that when combatants transition from being combatants to civilians, they need to be supported economically through maybe employment programs, or maybe through income generating projects, so that they do not use the skills that they have for them to engage in violent livelihood strategies, or as in the case of Zimbabwe, to continue to be remobilized for political violence. So I think that is particularly important and critical in the DDR process, that for it to be sustainable and for there to be sustainable peace, the ex-combatants need to be economically and socially reintegrated, and also sometimes even psychological intervention, psychosocial support, I think is also critical as a way of trying to enhance the sustainability of the DDR process. Otherwise, without that, it will remain, sustainable peace will remain very elusive. We would have a situation whereby ex-combatants would resort to their skills for them to survive, which sometimes may involve the use of violence. So thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you. In the meantime, more questions have appeared. There is what I would describe as an explanation by Aishetu Sambo. I don't see the question. She explains something. Then there's Fode Yusu. He says, Professor Bangura, in the context of Sierra Leone's DDR program, how were gender-specific challenges addressed during the reintegration process? And what strategies were implemented to ensure equitable opportunities for both male and female ex-combatants in post-conflict society? Matilda Usiku says and asks, is there any DDR program in northern part of Mozambique, in particular Cabo Delgado? Titi Lope Ajayi asks, are we seeing any differences in approach and logic in DDRRR strategies among the so-called Triangle of Security in Africa, UN, AU, REX, and how this might be affecting the state of play observed in the book? Also, big congrats to my colleagues on this great feat. Looking forward to reading. And we have Wamuyu Wachira. Great presentation. I have not read the book, but I would be interested on knowing whether the book dealt with reinsertion and demining. And lastly, Helen Nyagoya. Congratulations to Bangura and team. Is there a role for other mechanisms for seeking justice? That is, truth and reconciliation process or international courts play towards a successful DDR, especially for children? So Ibrahim, I will let you speak briefly to this, and then each of our contributors will have to respond to questions raised either in the chat. We won't take more questions after this in the chat, question and answer box. And then you will come back to give us an overview. So please, can you respond to the question that was addressed directly to you? And we'll ask each of the contributors to answer to these questions, as well as the points raised by our reviewers. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, just very quickly. The case of Sierra Leone was a very challenging one, and we experienced the marginalization of women and girls. This was not unique to Sierra Leone, as the same was experienced, especially at that material point where the use of traditional DDR was in play. This was about 20, 30 years ago. And one of the recollection in relation to what could have been done different was actually done by Irma in the book she wrote, titled Red Shoes, bringing to the fore the way women and girls were disadvantaged and not included in processes, even though they had actively participated in conflict, and which also led to a redefinition of who is a combatant when it comes to DDR processes. So the expansion of the definition to ensure that all those who either played active or passive roles, like being cooks, sex slaves, bushwives, were also integrated and supported. So a lot has changed since then, but those earlier programs, we are not the best of examples when it comes to gender mainstreaming and equality. One point I need to touch on is the one made by Nelson Atong, which is a really good one. on distinguishing between violence and non-violence or end of violence in post-conflict settings. And this is a study that I'm currently working on. I title it The Reproduction of Violence and Brutality in Post-War Sierra Leone, because you see the continuation of violence in multiple forms, mostly stemming from the experiences of either the pre-war or the war period. And so the sharp distinction of now we're in the peace phase normally is something that we need to carefully look at, because the end of civil wars do not necessarily mean the end of violence. So the question on demining and reinsertion is examined in the book. The introductory chapter speaks on it. Demining, not much. This is one of the areas we need to cover in the next volume. So I'll let the others speak on the other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So please, we would like to hear from our contributors. Irma has already, yes, Irma, you have the floor, 2 minutes.
I need much less than that. I'm, sorry, just a second. Hello. Sorry. There was one question. What would be the perfect DDR program? Like, what would be the end result of one of the people? And I think what I just like to share a sentence here that I always use, and Ibrahim knows it very well, and it says, let's pretend they start a war and nobody shows up. So, and I think that would be the end result. So there will always be people that want to start a conflict or mobilize young people for gain elections, money, drugs, and no matter what. But the problem is that in many countries in Africa and other parts of the world, there are too many young people that have nothing, and they're easy to mobilize. So what I think a successful DDR program is that if you go to all these ex-combatants, the commander comes back or somebody else and say, hey, come, I have again a job for you. They would say, no, sorry, I'm in school, I have a job, I'm with my family, or whatever reason. I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jibril Sese, do you have something to say in 2 minutes?
Yeah, mute. You're on mute.
Hey, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I want to speak to the points that had been raised. One is about
you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, one is about religion. You know, in Sierra Leone, we see the role that religious organizations played. For example, inter-religious council, and that were pivotal to many of the DDR processes in the country. And also the fact that we usually forget about what we would call informal DDR processes. You know, but communities themselves, you know, going out there to demobilize, I mean, their relatives and friends and other people and bring them home, and sometimes reintegrated without the knowledge of the formal, more liberal ways of looking at how DDR operates. Another thing again that we want to also look at is about DDRs and drugs, you know, and the fact that a lot of armed formations are involved in narco trafficking and all that, and in these discussions about the role that we could integrate those discussions into DDR analysis, largely being absent, how we could bring that in, and we see that happening in the rise of narco states all over, and groups cashing in on that to move on those sort of things. Another thing again is about how wars themselves led to destruction of certain religious sites and all that, and how those could also be part of processes to reintegrate and build harmonious societies. In Sierra Leone, there were deliberate attempts by armed groups to destroy, for example, secret groves, you know, Sodaditis and all that were themselves, you know, part of societies' organization of themselves and legitimizing a number of these normative structures within society, how those particular things were destroyed. Another thing again is that the sort of relationship between DDR processes and the state, and the fact that most states are very muscular, and that DDR processes tend to be very, very muscular and tend not to see women in terms of women as either perpetrators or women as victims or women and as people who could as a social group that could contribute positively and greatly within the whole gamut of DDR processes. So that again is because a lot of, especially with the first generation DDRs and a number of other DDRs, is about taking arms away and monopolizing them within particular aspects of particular sectors of the state, and how that by itself marginalizes women. So we need to look into some of those other things. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Sesi. Now we will go quickly to Luisa Maria Dietrich Ortega.
Hi. Thank you so much. I don't mean to take much time. There was one question around whether DDR program, and it's now gone, enables people to think differently about the time they engaged in armed struggle. What this question generated with me was definitely, but investment needs to be made in enabling ex-combatants. I'm thinking here also about female combatants in organizing themselves. So these efforts around organization of women-led organizations, community-based groups. This is sometimes not really kind of envisioned by DDR programs, because the idea is to kind of break command structures. However, we are social beings, and generating groups and organization makes sense also for the collective voice. Another issue I wanted to raise is just for those of us interested on elements and issues around women combatants and ex-combatants. Next year is the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And I still think it is a blind spot on the research agenda, how to engage with women combatants within WPS. For those of you still searching for a dissertation or a thesis topic, I think that might be quite interesting to explore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Now we go to Dr. Gukurume.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think I'll be very quick, and I'll try to respond to the question on Mozambique, I think because it's more closer home, around DDR. Yeah, I think in Mozambique, just like in Zimbabwe, the DDR process after independence was also very problematic. And I think because of the liberation movements that fought for independence, we have organizations that, for instance, were sort of disgruntled after independence because of maybe not being properly reintegrated and also benefiting from the independence process. So you have Renamo, for instance, which was led by Alfonso Dhlakama. I think there's a lot of literature around that, how it constantly fought against Frelimo. And I think that is also very close to what is happening in the North, where the majority of the young people in the North are economically marginalized, in spite of the fact that there was the discovery of oil and transnational neoliberal enclave were established there, but the employment in most cases favored people that were not necessarily from the North. And that is one of the reasons why then many people then became easily mobilized into militant and groups. Of course, I mean, there are so many reasons, and it's more complex than what I've just highlighted, but I think that is one of the key issues, that young people are aggrieved because of the systematic and structural marginalization from economic and material opportunities. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Now we are at 12 noon, New York time. I will crave the indulgence of our participants and our audience to just take 5 minutes more. In those 5 minutes, I'm going to ask our two discussants whether they can take 1 minute to just respond to the various things they have heard, and if they have any final last words before I bring it back to Ibrahim for his closing remarks, which will be no longer than 2 minutes. So Aziz and Nelson, Any famous last words?
Okay, well, I just want to commend Professor Ibrahim Bangura for this very beautiful and well delivered book projects. And I also want to commend him to go further, to expand the frontiers of knowledge. But there's a missing link that I couldn't mention the other time. Somebody has although mentioned it. And that is the attack on heritage sites, cultural heritage sites. It is very important to people. So during DDR, these are not captured. This particular aspect is not captured because at times this represents the history and totality of people. And these sites are destroyed, right? So I think it should be part of the process of, erasing bad memories or, integrating people. So the issue of cultural heritage should be part of the DDR, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to congratulate
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, Nelson, your 1 minute.
No, so I'm going to use half of my 1 minute to say thank you to Professor Bangura and the authors for the book. I think it really enriches the space of intellectual and policy engagement on the subject. I will still go back to the question that I asked, which is, what are the kind of normative tools that we need to deploy to be able to make sense of what a successful DDR is? And it's in part because I think the book gives us a very good invitation to reflect on practice and ideas that have driven DDR. And so I know this cannot be resolved, and it's a continuous process. And I also, as a social scientist, I'm aware that we are grappling with complexity and paradox in that even when we answer a question, it poses new questions. But it's going to be very important for us to think, when we think of DDR as an important tool within the broader arsenal of community recovery, what kinds of normative tools should we deploy that will enable us to better understand its place in that broader collective recovery? And on that note, I just want to thank Professor Cyril and also the organizers from SSLC for this opportunity, and hopefully we can keep the conversation going.
Thank you very much. With all these discussions, questions, presentations, the book is hereby launched. It is my pleasure to now ask the editor, Professor Ibrahim Bangura, to wrap up in 2 minutes.
Let me show you the book. So, yes, launched. Boom. Thank you very much. And again, for me, there's the need for more engagement. And there are very relevant questions raised today. And these are things that we discussed. A lot of them we discussed when we are putting together this volume. In fact, it's reached a point where we had to take off 3 chapters because Routledge was very insistent on the number of pages that they could accommodate. And that was, in fact, what led me to do a separate article on DDR and SSR. So if you look at the volume, it's not included. And so there are many other areas we wanted to cover, and that is why the work for the next volume begins now. And I also indicated, as I was speaking earlier, that the context is evolving. The challenges are spreading. And there are lots of things we need to take into consideration. And in 2016, I wrote a paper I titled "We Can't Eat Peace." We Can't Eat Peace. And this was based on a conversation with a former combatant in Sierra Leone. Because it draws to mind the question that if the context does not change, there's the potential for relapse. And DDR is a political process. It's a political process. It's hinged on political will and interest. Political will and interest. So if you see Somalia, DRC, and others continuously for the last 20 plus years grappling with multiple processes that are not succeeding, it's because the context has not changed. We're also experiencing the large presence of gangs and cliques in African cities, mostly in a post-conflict context. These are young people who fought against their states, became disillusioned, can no longer fight, but are looking for the various means of expression, also various means of identity recognition and the voice. So our work begins now. We'll be reaching out to a lot of you new contributors. And let me end by saying thank you to Nelson Opong and our dear professor from Oye-Ekiti. I was there with Cyril Obi a long time ago. I want to go again. And also all the contributors for the fantastic work you've done, the APN team. This is above the top. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Thank you very much. I will not attempt to summarize anything. All I'll just say is to echo Ibrahim's message of thanks. Thanks to Ibrahim. Thanks to Irma, Jibril, Luisa, Simbarashi, Aziz, and Nelson. And thanks to the APN team, Max, Kate, Sarah, and Eugene. We will be launching another book by a former APN fellow next month. We will be sending you invitations. And thank you to each and every member of this distinguished audience for your patience and for your attention. Please stay tuned. Have a nice rest of the day and come back when we invite you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.